the tools will supplant the mediocre. The tools will supplant the good. But because the truly great are so unique, that's very hard to supplant, because mathematically there's just not enough data of the truly unique, by definition, to ever have tools effectively replace that completely.
Welcome to the AI for Creative Entrepreneurs podcast. I'm Kira Hug, co-founder of the Copywriter Club. And on this show, our goal is to help you stay ahead of the curve. We'll show you how to use AI to maximize your creativity, simplify your work and life, and reinvent your creative career so AI works for you, not against you. Join us as we explore the intersection of AI, creativity, and career. Technology moves fast, but few spaces evolve as quickly as artificial intelligence. As soon as we get used to one new AI tool or platform, 3 more pop up that promise to be bigger and better and faster. But are these new technologies really serving creatives and entrepreneurs, or are they just adding to the noise? Today's guest, Christopher Penn, cuts through the hype and helps us understand how to use AI intentionally. As co-founder and chief data scientist at Trust Insights, Christopher immerses himself in understanding not just what's possible with new technology, but also what's practical and purposeful. In our conversation, Christopher explores how generative AI can augment creative work and business operations in surprising new ways. We also dive into the implications of fine-tuning AI models, best practices for prompt engineering, and why creators should approach our words as code. Christopher's refreshing perspective will leave you feeling informed, inspired, and ready to use AI more skillfully. But before we jump into that interview, this podcast is sponsored by AI for Copywriters and Creatives, the course that's helped more than 200 copywriters and content writers learn how to use AI as a creative partner in their businesses. Once you've been through it, you'll be able to confidently use AI tools in your writing and your research processes and your strategic thinking so you can show up as a consultant with your clients. The course includes 5 modules that break down how to use generative AI and ChatGPT. Also, an updated list that we keep up to date because tools are changing every single day, but you have access to a robust list of over 100 of the best tools for writers. You also have access to dozens of lessons and over-the-shoulder demonstrations, so you can actually see how to use these different tools in action. And at the end, you'll have the opportunity to be certified as a prompt engineer, which is an easy way to demonstrate your new skill set when talking to clients. If you're interested, you can check out this course by going to copywriterclub.com/AI4C. Okay, let's kick off our episode with Christopher. All right, Christopher, I have 2 favorite quotes from your presentation at MACON. One of them was, generative models are really good at mansplaining. And the second one was, everyone is a developer. And I think that second one really changed the way I look at what I do as a writer, and was such a mindset shift and so powerful. So my first question for you is, what is singularity? We're going to go really big. Let's just start with the big question to kick it off.
The singularity is a reference to Ray Kurzweil, who had said that you achieve such technological progress that you eventually get to a point where there's this massive change, right? Artificial intelligence essentially becomes uncontrollable and irreversible. That's really what the singularity means. And we don't mean like Skynet, right? We don't mean like, Terminators and stuff. We mean that you can't put the cat back in the bag. Once people are using generative AI tools, you can't take that away from them. Even if like the big service providers were to go out of business tomorrow, there's so many open source models now that this is a technology that's now permanently a part of the marketing landscape.
So I guess when I've heard other people talk about it, it sounded like we weren't quite there yet. But when you talk about it, it sounds like we've been there for a while.
We've been doing artificial intelligence from a theoretical perspective since the 1950s. And in fact, today's AI architecture is based on concepts from neuroscience from the 50s and 60s, right? So think about just how old this field is. Now, what has changed in the last 30 years is computational power, the ability for computers to do much more than they could, 60s and 70s and the 80s. Like your watch has more compute power now than, most supercomputers did back then. And with the rise of these different technologies, you're bringing these theories to life. Even the technology, the underpinning technology of generative AI, of things like Chat GPT, for example, that's based on a paper that's 6 years old now, on Transformers, and not the very fun '80s cartoon, but the the technology of basically saying let's predict sequences of data and project what's ahead, but being able to keep in context all of that information. And so, yeah, I would say that 2017, when that paper came out, really was the dawn of this generative AI singularity. It is the technology that, along with diffusers, is and has changed marketing and writing and content creation irrevocably.
So would you say there's no off switch at this point?
There's definitely not an off switch. Um, I'll give you an example. Facebook Meta. I keep calling it Facebook. The Meta released the Llama 2 model series. This is the same sort of engine, if you will, that powers systems like ChatGPT. But what's different is that instead of making it a service where you go on the web and stuff, they actually handed people the software. Like here's the raw guts, the engine of, if you will. And they said, people can build their own car around this engine, but here's the engine. Whereas a company like OpenAI is like, come test drive our car, but we own the car and you can't have it. Because they did that, this technology is now in the wild. You cannot take it back. You cannot turn it off. You cannot make it go away.
So when people talk about turning it off, like what do you think? Does it just make them feel more comfortable? And I'm talking about people who are working in the space and knowledgeable who are still saying that.
Well, okay, so I have some opinions here that that verge into politics, but part of it is a number of the people, there's particularly certain very prominent people who might or might not be, setting a certain social network on fire, are talking about, pauses because their own companies are not keeping up. They're not leaders in the space. And so a pause would benefit them to the detriment of some of their competitors. So I take things like that with a grain of salt. I like to ask who benefits. And there's definitely a commercial interest at work there. There is definitely reason for caution. These models, the best way to explain a large language model to folks who don't understand it is imagine imagine you traveled the world. You got on a plane, went to every single city in every single country, and you ate pizza in every city, and you took notes as you did so. By the end of your trip, you would be severely ill, but in addition, you would have notes on every pizza combination you've ever tried. A language model is essentially that. So all these companies have gone out and gathered all this text from around the internet, distilled it down into Cliff's notes essentially, and that is the model that then when you ask it questions, it spits out answers. And so because these models are trained on everything, they are a reflection of humanity. And humanity, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. And that's in these tools, right? So there is absolutely sexism and racism and bigotry and stuff, as well as tomato salad recipes. There's the gamut of human content, which makes the models very capable, but it also can have them doing problematic things. So that's one aspect of, should there be more governance around these things? The challenge is now, especially now that they've been released as open source and anyone can run them on their own computers, the ability for any entity like a government or something to turn off or to say, hey, you have to regulate this is gone. That window is closed. So what we now have to think about is these models have to be treated kind of like any other tool, right? If you own a chainsaw, you can do very good things, right? Build houses, and just stuff like that. You can also do very bad things, Friday the 13th kind of stuff. We don't regulate the use of the chainsaw. Well, we don't regulate the chainsaw itself. Like we don't say to the chainsaw manufacturer, hey, make sure this can't cut people. Right? We don't do that. We instead regulate the use of it to say, like, hey, you probably should not go murder people with a chainsaw. And that's what we're going to have to do with these models. Is you can't regulate the technology just because it's out there and it's agnostic, but you can absolutely say, hey, don't use it for this.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And I know it's funny because I was reviewing your presentation and watching the whole thing again, and I realized there's so many takeaways that I'm now implementing or thinking deeply about that came straight from your talk. And one of them was related to just safety of data privacy and being really careful. And that stood out to me because I do a lot of work with clients and I have a lot of their survey data. And even though they're small business owners, but I want to be really careful. So can you talk a little bit about how we should think about protecting that information on maybe local computers and using Llama versus ChatGPT so that we're just being really smart as small business owners and creatives?
So there's a couple of different angles here that people need to understand. One is with a big provider like OpenAI, like ChatGPT, for example, everything you type in that tool is going to a third party. Whether or not they say they're trustworthy, the reality is your data is going somewhere else. And other people, humans at those companies, routinely review the data that is submitted by users to help tune the tools. So Google Bard, Microsoft Bing, ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, you name it. Anytime you're just in a little web browser and you're doing this stuff, you are handing over data. You should know personal identifying information, sensitive protected information, and protected healthcare information are the three big categories of data you must not use these tools with. You cannot use it because you are just violating all sorts of rules, regulations, and laws, and bad things happen. There is an entire ecosystem of open source tools. So the tool that I recommend for most beginners right now is one called LM Studio. If you Google LM Studio, it's a language model studio. It is free open source software that you download and run on your laptop. Now, your laptop or your desktop should have the ability to play video games, right? If it can play really good video games really well, like World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, then you'll be fine. If you can't play those games, that because of the underlying technology, it won't run language models very well either. Once you're in LM Studio, then you go into there and you say, okay, I want to download some of these open source models. And there's thousands of them to download. The primary repository most people go to is a site called Hugging Face, after the emoji. And what you do then is you download that model, the model of your choice based on your needs. And there's a whole set of categories. And you say, I want to use this one. You turn it on within LM Studio, and now when you're talking to it, it's only running on your laptop. It's not running on the internet. You could unplug your cables and turn off your Wi-Fi, and it'll work great, right? And that's the tool that you use for sensitive data, because the data is not going anywhere else except inside the little model on your computer. That for any kind of creator is essential. Now, the challenge is you have to figure out which model to use, because again, there are thousands of them. There are some that are dedicated towards like coding. There's one, for example, called Cherry Pop, which is very popular for writing Python code. There are some that are fiction writing tools, like Mythomax, for example. I realized the other day that all of these language models, names kind of sound like marijuana strains. um, there's one for just editors called Karen the Editor. Like it's literally the model name is called Karen the Editor. It just does grammar correction and things. So you do have to take some time to learn the landscape and figure out which model you want. But that's the way you would use these tools.
So, what do you think is the best path forward for someone who is still new and navigating all these tools in the first, they've only been doing it for about 6 months? Is it to feel comfortable with a tool that maybe is a little bit easier to use because everybody's talking about it, like ChatGPT, right? I feel very comfortable using that tool just to kind of get the hang of it, and then you go in and to LM and then you're smarter about it and also more sophisticated in your use? Or do you think you should just jump in there from the beginning, week 2 to be extra safe? What's
Um,
realistic for people?
I think starting with the foundation models is the most important thing. So that means you learn to use ChatGPT, preferably the paid version, because you will get access to GPT-4, which is the most advanced model. For content creators, particularly writers, I would say you should learn Anthropic's Claude 2, which is also it's very similar to ChatGPT, same style interface, because that one can handle a lot of text. Like you can put in a 60,000 word book into it and have it summarize it and ask questions of it. Those are sort of the foundational technologies I would start with there. For image creation, which uses a separate technology called diffusers, I'd use Microsoft Bing's Image Creator. Those three tools have the lowest technical bar to entry. It's just a web page, right? And still have very good capabilities for someone to start learning how to do things like prompt engineering.
Okay. And it's probably still safe, I guess, just please confirm this, if I'm using a tool, again, like ChatGPT, and I'm doing some basic research, right? I'm not sharing any private information, names, but I may be pulling in avatar information, adjectives to describe my avatar, and then coming up with themes or unique mechanisms. So at that level, do you feel like it's safe enough to use some of these tools before we're like, okay, I have to use my own server, and I need to stop using these tools?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's how you learn the basics, right? You learn, okay, how do I write a good prompt? How do I use the tools to help me write a good prompt? How do I how do I understand what the tools are and are not capable of? Because there are technical limitations, and then there are sort of rule based limitations. For example, you cannot ask ChatGPT, "Hey, how do I make C4 at home?" Right, the high explosive. They will say, "Nope, not going to help you with that." Um, so there are those limitations that you want to be aware of with these tools too, and there are some surprising ones. Um, for example. For example, I was using Microsoft Bing's image creator, and I told it I want an image of a person at a whiteboard holding a tape measure against the whiteboard, but the tape measure was limp, and it blocked. It blocked it. It just blocked it. You
Yeah,
cannot use the word limp in prompts. I'm like,
good
it's
to
a
know.
tape measure. But again, that comes with learning how the tools work.
Right, right. Good to know. How do you feel personally about using tools and really being smart about and intentional about the companies you're supporting because of their mission, and whether or not they seem aligned with their mission and actually walking their talk? I feel like at this stage, after using the tools for 6 months, I'm like, I feel like I need to stop using certain tools where it just, the founder might seem a little shady, or it seems like they're not actually doing what they say they're going to do, and they're trying to seem like they're helping the world, but they're actually working with lobbyists. And so I guess, how do you approach that, where you want to use tools, but you also want to support the larger companies that seem to be doing some good, or at least somewhat responsible? How do you see that?
Um, it depends. It depends on which values are in question. For example, there's a lot of companies, for example, that donate to certain politicians that I really wish they wouldn't, and yet those companies are somewhat inescapable. If you wanted to stop using them, like Google, you would have to essentially vanish from the internet. It'd be very, very difficult to do work without having those capabilities around. Um, in the language modeling space, in the large language models in particular, it's a mixed bag, because we know, for example, Meta, the company that runs Facebook, has a whole huge host of ethical problems. Like they and data privacy don't really dine at the same. They don't even dine at the same table. They don't dine at the same restaurant, um, and yet they open sourced their core language model and the weights to use it. Now they're not making direct money from it. We're not paying them money for it, and so there's less of a direct exchange of value there, but there still is that, well, you are using their model, and their model has certain biases to it. The reality is that there's probably a handful of maybe 5 or 10 companies in the world that have the compute power and infrastructure to truly build solid foundational models, right? IBM, Amazon, Google, basically all the big tech companies. And so to avoid using their individual technologies or their stuff is going to be challenging, because they all have ethics issues, right? They all have values issues. So it's a question of who's the least bad. Um, and in some ways, you may want to think of it almost like a carbon credit, right? If you do business with a company, like we do this with public speaking, I travel all over, I speak in all sorts of places. There are a whole bunches of places in the world, particularly in the USA, where the government and the people in those places, I don't support what they support. For example, I happen to think that LGBTQ plus people should have equal rights. It just, to me, is a non-issue. There's a whole bunch of people who don't think that's the case. So if I have to travel on business to those states, I tally up my expenditures, and then we make contributions to an organization like HRC after the trip to say, okay, well, I spent this much money in this state that I really dislike. So here, HRC is the equivalent amount of money in donations to offset the harm that my necessary expenditures were.
That's really cool. That's such a great idea too to think about it that way. I'm going to jump over to use cases, and I know that you shared a bunch of different ideas. Some of them are, I guess, more familiar, like writing generation, but you shared a bunch of use cases that were less common, like professional development. Are you able to just kind of talk through some of the ones that might be most relevant to writers and creative freelancers?
With writing and freelancing in particular, um, these language models have what we call perfect memory. The large models have essentially ingested all this text, and the more common something is, the better it remembers it, right? If I say, I pledge allegiance to the, what's the next word?
Flag.
Right. It's one of those things where you can't help but actually, even if you don't say it, you think it, right? It's so reflexive because it's such a high probability. We've seen that text so much. These models contain perfect memory of all of these things, which means that you can absolutely use them, for example, not only to do professional development. Like one of my favorite things to do is say, hey, explain this concept to me in terms of pizza. Right. So you take a very complex thing like the model parameters and weights and how they apply in large language models, and you hear all this the mathematics about it, and you're like, I still don't get it. You say, explain it to me in terms of pizza, and says, okay, in terms of pizza, model parameters are the variety of ingredients, and the weights are how many of each ingredient there is on top of your pizza. Like, oh, I get it. That makes total sense to me now. And so anytime as a writer, as a content creator, if you've been given an assignment from a client that you don't understand or you don't think you understand well enough, you can ask these tools, hey, explain it to me in terms that I understand, right? Maybe you play piano, have it explain it to something into you in terms of the circle of fifths, right? Maybe you do art, have someone explain it to you in terms of impressionism versus neoclassicism, whatever the thing is. These tools are very good at that. But also, when it comes to content creation, people don't put enough detail in their prompts. People try to do as little as possible with prompts, and that's a bad idea because what you should be doing with prompts is providing all of the guardrails and all the suggestions, maybe even some examples, so that the tools generate better output. So, for example, if you're saying, hey, I want you to write this blog post about this thing, you should also give it a paragraph of your own writing and say, hey, this is the kind of writing I want you to imitate. So it's called few shot training, where you're giving it these things so that it does a better job of imitating the style that you want. If you've got a client, for example, say you're writing for maybe IBM, take 4 or 5 blog posts from IBM's website, put each one into a language model, and say, summarize the writing style of this blog post, and then you can do that, and then it'll spit out sort of summaries. You kind of condense that down and say, now you've got a style template for your client IBM, and now every time you write content for them, you use that style template in your prompt, and now you sound much more like them than you would without that. Because kind of the quote we started off at the beginning of the show, this being the world's best mansplainers, they do that because that's sort of the average of language. But just because it's the average of all language does not mean that you can't be much more specific and get much better results. The other thing that I love to do, and this is something for folks who are doing things like sales copy and sales collateral, I put a buyer persona in my prompt. I'll say, here's the buyer persona. Review my sales copy and tell me if this would be appealing to my buyer, or if there are other things that maybe I forgot, or that might turn off my buyer. And the tools will give you feedback on your own writing. You don't have to use them to create content. You can have them be a first pass editor, a first pass sensitivity reader, anything where you need an extra set of eyes on your content. These tools can do that.
What other tips do you have for sales copy? Because I write a lot of sales copy, so that's a great one. Anything else that I probably am not doing that I should be doing?
One of my personal favorites is to, if you know the kind of person that you're selling to, get 3 or 4 of their LinkedIn profiles and copy them and turn that into part of the prompt. Here is exactly who I'm selling to, because their LinkedIn profile contains the language they wrote about themselves and how they speak about themselves. And then you can have it modify your sales content to speak exactly to that person.
Okay, that's good. I'm snagging that. And while we're talking about prompts, I feel like the way you were talking about prompts was a little bit different than whatever else I've heard, as far as protecting them and thinking about them in terms of your code. And thinking about everything else you can do with prompt deployment and fine tuning, I feel like that's all next level, but it's really exciting. So how would that apply maybe to a writer, or again, like some creative freelancer?
So the way we talk about prompts is they're programming language, right? They are a programming language. When you write a programming language in like Python or Java, you're writing out specific instructions to a computer to generate a repeatable result. When you are working with a system like ChatGPT and you're putting in plain language, you are still writing a programming. Right? You are still writing this software to tell a machine what to do and to have a generate a predictable outcome, which means that your words, even though they look like English or Czech or Russian or Japanese or whatever language you write in, your words are still code and you need to protect it like code. How do companies protect code, right? They copyright it, they protect it, they keep it secured, they don't share it on LinkedIn as here's my top 50 prompts, right? You don't see anyone saying here's our top 50 Python libraries we've written to optimize our internal operations. Companies don't do that, and yet people are doing that with their prompts. And well, it's very generous. It is probably not something that people are thinking about, like, oh, this is actual intellectual property that I should be protecting. One of the things that I strongly recommend everyone do who's using these tools, which will be everyone, is have a prompt library. So it can be a tool like Microsoft OneNote or Evernote or Joplin or whatever, and just bank these prompts as you write them so that you have a library to look back on. Mine's up to something like 300-ish different prompts now of all these different tasks because I want to be able to go back and refer to them later on. And so for content creators, you definitely want to do that. As of the end of 2023, we are going to see language model integration in tools like Microsoft Office, like Microsoft Windows, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Google Docs, Gmail. It's already in Adobe products like Photoshop and Illustrator. Every one of these things, every one of these tools, because they're going to have these language integrations, you're going to have prompts to work with them, and you want to protect those. You want to share those internally at your company. Maybe if you're a freelancer, then maybe you want to share it with trusted non-competitive freelancers in your network. But you absolutely want to keep a hold of those. So if you say, like, I got this prompt that will distill down an Excel spreadsheet and deliver a report exactly the way I want and turn it into a PowerPoint presentation, hold on to that. That's super valuable content.
Do you feel like that will continue to be valuable as prompts are suggested to you with some of these tools, or it's like, here's how you could say this better? Or do you think it will always be important if you can pull together a really creative, solid prompt?
It will evolve, and a big part of that is the underlying models and how they evolve as well. So for example, if you're starting to see now some tools being able to do suggestions, like ChatGPT can do suggestions, just because it's suggested does not mean it's optimized well. You're going to see relatively short directional suggestions, as opposed to like multi-page prompts. If you use a tool like Anthropic's Claude, you can put up to 100,000 tokens, about 60,000 words into Claude as a prompt, right? Which is basically a book. Um, no tool is going to suggest here's a 48-page prompt that you can put into the tool, right? So you will still have really good examples of those tools where of those prompts where you will have custom prompts that will deliver really solid results. That also is going to vary based on how the model ecosystem itself changes. If you are using some of these open source models within your company, you may do some tuning on your company's data to make that model work better with your company's data. And if it does that, then you definitely are not going to get, Clippy, the 2023 version of Clippy popping up and say, hey, would you like to process this healthcare data? Like, that will not be happening. And so you will still need good prompt engineering skills to work with systems where you're working with protected data.
And maybe you can walk through this with me. This is more of a selfish question, but I if I have a process in place to create a unique mechanism for my clients, I love creating those for them. I have a ton of prompts that have helped me create that. So I feel like the next step is to fine tune and to turn that into something else I could use. And I'm almost like, I don't quite know what that next phase is, but I know there's something there. How would you approach that and think about it?
So when you were talking about fine tuning a model, we're talking about, uh, I liken it to dogs, right? So your general house dog does a bunch of things, not one thing any particularly well, but it does a dog does a bunch of things. If you take a dog, maybe of a certain breed, and you train it, like you're just going to be a bomb sniffing dog. That is your purpose in life. That dog gets very good at that, but then that dog probably is not as good a house pet. That dog can't chase squirrels as well in the backyard. That dog can't smell for drugs or earthquake survivors because the dog is very focused on one task. That's what fine tuning a model does. So if there is a super high value task that either will save you a ton of time or makes you a bunch of money, then you'll want to look at taking one of the models off the shelf, from the open source ones, and saying, I want to tune this thing down to be very good at this specific set of tasks. That means it's not going to write poetry anymore. It's not going to tell jokes. It's not going to write limericks as nearly as well, but it's going to do that one thing really, really, really well. And so as you think about the deployment of these tools, that's how you're going to mentally arrange them to say, I want it to do X.
And then I mean, this is kind of a basic question, but like, what am I using to do that type of fine tuning so that it's just a specialized tool?
That is going to require some technical expertise. So you'll get an open source model, probably one of the Llama family models, and then you will get a development environment. The probably the one that's best known has a stupid name. It's called Ooga Booga. And
That's
in
great.
there you'll be presented with a massive set of tools to modify a model. You will also need a lot of data of examples of what you want it to do. So if you were to train it to say write invoices, then you would have a database that you would provide it of maybe thousands of invoices and thousands of corresponding prompts for each invoice to say, like, here's what we want this thing to do. And that gets fed into the training software to then tune the model to basically nudge it in a specific direction.
Okay. So it might take a little bit of effort. it's
It takes quite a lot of effort. It takes quite a lot of effort. Companies like McKinsey, for example, charge between $3 and $10 million to do that.
Oh, okay. Well, that might be my new service that I roll out. I like that price range. Okay, and while we're talking about prompt engineering and even just creating this fine tuning, what do you see as some of these new roles and jobs and positions when you're thinking about, okay, this role didn't exist a year ago, but this is going to be a new career for someone, at least for a year?
I can't even tell you what's going to happen month to month. That's how fast the space is evolving. But there definitely are roles for people who want to be working on the technical side of things to be able to tune models and things. There are definitely roles for people doing prompt engineering because, again, you're going to see this stuff in Microsoft Office, right? So even though like the most high value prompts and things will be turned into software, will be turned into custom models and stuff, there will still be tons and tons and tons of people just they're in Microsoft Word. Clippy pops up. Okay, what do I tell how do I prompt Clippy? So being able to train and teach people how to do intelligent prompts that get them what they need faster. There are enormous roles for governance around data, for process management, because these tools are just tools, right? If you have the best appliances in the world, but you don't know how to cook, and your ingredients suck, and your kitchen's half on fire most of the time, it doesn't matter how good the appliances are, you're not cooking anything, right? You're not making dinner. So all of those other aspects in that kitchen need to be fixed too, and the same is true of AI. Just because you have great AI tools does not mean it's going to automatically fix your finance system, your HR system, and all these other aspects within a company that you would want help with.
So, what about for creative types? What would you suggest? I mean, definitely prompt engineering could work really well for them, scripting for voice and conversation AI. What else should we be thinking about?
Lots of ideation stuff. So these tools are enormously powerful ideation tools that can do brainstorming with you. They can function like a brainstorming partner. You can have conversations with them, like living human conversations. Hey, what do you think about this? Or what about this idea? Um, there is there is almost no limit to how well you can converse with any of these tools in real time and get ideas that you can then expand on. There's a recent study done saying that on average, content creators and users who use AI tools had a 30% increase in creativity compared to people who did not use AI tools. And we're all looking at that going, wow, that is, most of the time you're looking for performance improvements like 2 to 3%, and we're talking 20 to 30% is gigantic. So for creators, these things should be like, the intern or the junior's assistant that you always wish you could afford, but don't.
Yeah, that the 20 to 30% is incredible. I mean, I've felt it myself, but I didn't know it was quite that dramatic. How do you think about just our current roles? And I mean, a lot of writers ask me, like, do you think I should even pursue this path as a copywriter or a content writer? Is it worth it at this point if it's going to disappear? And so, how do you think about that?
It depends on how skilled you are, right? So think about this. These tools are a mathematical average of what they're prompted for, right? So if you're really good at prompt engineering, you can get exceptionally good output, but you have to be really good at prompt engineering. The average user is not. To be a really good writer, you have to be, you have to have outstanding writing skills, command of the knowledge, and understanding psychology and how people think and how people react to specific sequences of words and what appeals and all that stuff. And then you have a whole bunch of people who are okay writers or maybe not very good writers. The tools will supplant the mediocre. The tools will supplant the good. But because the truly great are so unique, that's very hard to supplant because mathematically there's just not enough data of the truly unique by definition to ever have tools effectively replace that completely. Um, for the foreseeable future, you will see hybrids, people who are great writers with the power of AI become even greater writers. And the people who are mediocre writers and choose not to level up will simply just use AI or will not be using.
So, I should probably just tell them if you're exceptional, continue and move forward. But if you're not, like, maybe think about something else.
I think that's a fair way to say it.
Okay. All right. I'll say it in a nice way. Um, I'm curious what has surprised you or blown you away, or maybe more recently over the last few months that you've seen that you're like, wow, I didn't think that was possible quite yet. And I'm thinking of the pepperoni hug spot that you
The
mentioned that I checked out, and it looks like a bunch of zombies in that commercial. So maybe you could talk about that and anything else that's wowed you or surprised you.
So Pepperoni Hug Spot was interesting because it was generated in about 3 hours by a developer, soup to nuts, nothing else, no external inputs. Fable Studios did an even bigger and more amazing version where they they trained an ensemble of models to generate an entire episode of South Park. And in about 3 hours' time, it generated the whole episode, voices, script. Now, it wasn't very good, right? Because they used Chat GPT, the GPT-4 model, which is heavily censored. The normal dialogue you would expect out of South Park was not there because the model would not allow it. Were they to use one of the uncensored models, they would have gotten a much better result. But the fact that they were able to create this ensemble of machinery and generate this incredible thing, you can't even get a writer's room for a TV show to agree on a plot in 3 hours, much less do the whole episode. So for I would call it programmatic types of entertainment content, yeah, these machines can do that. So the onus is then on us as creators to have original ideas because if it's formulaic, a machine can do it.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna ask you, well, what else does that tell you? Does it tell us that it's exciting because we could have our own show, so I can go and do this? Or is it just we need to push harder to be more original? I guess what are all the lessons from that for you?
The big lessons are, and this is the thing. So in the short term, we have the WGA strikes right now happening and the SAG after strikes and all that stuff. And in the short term, yes, like Hollywood studios are going to use AI and they're going to put a lot of writers and stuff out of jobs in the short term. The writing is on the wall for them as an industry because in 2 to 3 years or less, because again, the space is moving so fast, you will be able to sit at home and generate your own show, right? Like, I want to have it do this, 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 and this. You'll use Unreal Engine for the backdrop. So you use 11 Labs, the voices. You'll sew it all together. And the barrier to entry for making a show or a cinematic movie will go from $10 million to maybe $10,000 or maybe $1,000, and suddenly many more people can be content creators of rich media in the same way that blogging opened up the writing for everybody. And there's a lot of crap blogs out there, but there's a lot of good ones as well. The ability for fans to write fan fiction. You go over to Archive of Our Own, and there's like millions and millions of like long form fiction stories that people have written. And there is a future in which creators can generate a movie in their favorite franchise just as easily as they write a fan fiction in their favorite franchise, or they could actually just take their fan fiction and just have the script built from that. That's going to change entertainment. That's going to change content creation, because now the only thing that a studio would really have would be the intellectual property rights. And as more people become accustomed to these creative tools, the more you'll start seeing original properties, original ideas, original IP. And at that point, the entertainment industry will have to be thinking more about curation. Like, hey, how do we find the best idea creators out there and license their IP, as opposed to we are the ones who make the thing, right? So there is a sea change coming in that aspect of creative that no one is paying attention to right now, but it's going to be a really big deal in a few years.
That's really exciting. Where do you recommend going to just hear more about that side of it? I feel like that's less talked about. I mean, we're talking about the strikes, but we're not talking about what's happening underneath with these new shows and the possibility there.
No one's really talking about it. That's the
Okay,
problem.
just you.
So people just keep listening to Kira's podcast.
Okay. Before we start to wrap, kind of one practical question. I feel like you'll have a good answer for this. So, as we talk to our clients, and maybe it's on a sales call or it's on a kickoff call, and we're talking about our use of AI as a tool, how would you recommend talking about it so it doesn't scare people and it feels like a value add, and it doesn't necessarily make people feel uneasy about their data or anything like that? How would you construct that conversation?
I would absolutely be transparent and set policy. Here's how we do use AI. Here's how we don't. Here's the ways in which we use your data, and the ways we don't. I think that is very, very important. And that alone, transparency does so much to reassure people. Like, okay, I know what you're going to do. It's like having a new appliance in your kitchen. Like, I don't know what it does. Like, does it blend? Does it fry? We have no idea. As opposed to saying, here's the tool and here's the manual and here's exactly how we're going to use it and here's the recipes we use it for. That will reassure people that, okay, this is yet another tool in the toolbox that will help us do the thing that we want to do well, and will dispel unfounded fears, I think.
That's so helpful. Okay, I'm curious about what keeps you up at night. I know we talked at MACON as a group about, if you haven't had 3 sleepless nights, then you're not paying attention, and you are paying very close attention. So, what stresses you out at this point?
Oh, climate change. Climate change is going to destroy humanity. I'm not worried about AI. The fact that we have these loops of, if you look in the data, we are seeing not just the change is not linear; it's exponential. It's getting faster and faster and faster. And so everyone has to be looking at the data, because that's what we should be doing as rational people, and going, what should we do about this? Because we're past the point of no return on a lot of things. And there's a bunch of things that are happening now that people are like, oh, that'll happen in 2100. Now, 75 years from now, like, nope, it's happening now. And we are, as a civilization, wholly unprepared to deal with it. Like, if you look back at the last 3 years, we had a very clear and present danger with tangible actions to take, and a good percentage of humanity just kind of hosed it really badly. If we could not get people to take action on a clear and present danger with a short-term benefit and severe outcome, we're not going to get people to take action on something that's somewhat longer term. And so we're in a lot of trouble. So that if you want to know what keeps me up at night, it is essentially the planet will be fine. We are screwed as a species.
How do you reconcile that in your mind, just to keep going? And because I have that that keeps me up too. And so I'm like, how do I process this so that I can manage it and do something? But just, I don't know. How do you deal with that?
Well, I'm a practicing Buddhist, so nothing's permanent. My friend Kelsey likes to say, "I'm here for a good time, not a long time," and I think that approach of appreciate the things that you have now in the moment. Is really important. And that's been good advice for thousands of years, and it remains good advice in terms of how you plan and build things like your business and stuff. You should absolutely be thinking about business resilience, business continuity. What are your plans? If you're, if you're like a solopreneur or a content creator, what is your backup strategy? When was the last time you backed up your laptop and your files? Do you know how to resume your business if your laptop gets stolen, for example? What does that look like? Most people don't think about those things because they don't have any kind of continuity plans, and even the smallest business needs to have some way of, like, oh, look, a tornado. We need to adapt our business to be able to stay in business. So I encourage those dual precepts of appreciate what's happening, in the moment, and prepare for things to go wrong, because when they do, you won't be disappointed. You will be prepared.
Okay, and let's end on a positive note around what excites you right now. What is exciting you in the space that you're like, okay, this is great news?
Here's the thing that I appreciate about generative AI. It is an enabler, right? I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't compose music, but I can now with the assistance of AI. So I have all these ideas in my head that suddenly I can bring to life that I did not have the skills before. Right. So these things unlock our ideas and our creativity because it no longer requires skills that we don't have. We can write a prompt. We can roughly sketch something out in Microsoft Paint and see our ideas brought to life. And I believe that as long as we continue on the path of making these tools open and accessible to people and affordable, or just outright free, we will unlock more and more creativity in people and allow people to tell stories that otherwise would not be told. Going back to the film example, it costs a minimum of $10 million to make a feature film these days, right? That means you need to sell box office tickets and stuff like that. If you could crowdfund a film that only cost $1,000, how many people would want to go see a film about a black queer woman, in a certain circumstance? Not as many as you would make it a justifiable expense for a movie studio to invest in. In 2-3 years time, you're like, who cares? We got $1,000 that we raised among our friends. Now we get to tell the stories that we want about ourselves in ways that honor our traditions and that showcase diversity in positive ways, and there's no one stopping you, right? There's no one saying, "Up, you can't make that film. It's not going to be profitable." Who cares? I'm making it because I want to, because I can express myself as an artist. And for me, that is the most positive thing about these tools, is that they unlock our ability to express ourselves in ways that we cannot because of a lack of skills. I think that's good for humanity. That's good for just as us as individuals. It feeds our souls to be able to say, like, I can express myself in and what's in here can be brought into the world.
So, what is your next film or first film? What is the film you're working on?
I don't have one currently.
Okay. All right. So, for anyone who wants to get in touch with you or possibly maybe work with you or just hear more of your insights, where are the places we should go?
For anything work related, go to trustinsights.ai. And then for personal stuff, you can see that at christopherspenn.com. And you can find all the other stuff from there.
And you've got a newsletter and all the things.
Newsletters, YouTube channels, all the stuff. But those two websites will be the easiest places to find all that.
Okay, I'm signing up for all of it. And thank you so much for cramming, just like your presentation, you crammed so many insights and ideas into such a short period of time. So I thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care.
A huge thank you to Christopher Penn for being our guide to the galaxy of generative AI. As Christopher reminded us, these AI tools are a permanent part of the landscape. It's up to us to use them skillfully and intentionally. Throughout the conversation, Christopher gave me so much food for thought on how to be selective, protective, and purposeful with how I use AI. Hopefully, you feel just as empowered to use AI in new ways and bring your ideas to life. To learn more about Trust Insight, connect with Christopher on LinkedIn or visit trustinsights.ai. And once again, if you want to jump into our AI for Copywriters course, you can go to thecopywriterclub.com/AI4C. That's the end of this episode of AI for Creative Entrepreneurs, a Copywriter Club podcast produced by Brandon Burton. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please leave a review of the show on your podcast app so we can reach other creative entrepreneurs who are interested in exploring AI with us. Or if you're catching this on YouTube, you could always like this video or subscribe to the channel or leave a comment below and let us know your favorite takeaway from the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.